I remember the moment it hit me, a pattern almost invisible at first, but painful once I saw it clearly. Every time I felt things were finally turning around for me financially, something unexpected would pull the rug out from under my feet. It wasn't like a grand catastrophe, but smaller, subtle shifts that wrecked my progress. There was that one impulsive decision, a purchase I barely thought about, a regret that gnawed quietly afterward. Or maybe it was a stretch of days where I couldn't bring myself to open my bills or check my bank account. Sometimes, a nervous flutter of fear kept me from taking steps that I knew logically would help me grow. Every time, it felt like the same script playing out, quietly sabotaging what I had painstakingly built. This wasn't a one-off episode. It was a constant, frustrating cycle. And the strangest part? I couldn't pinpoint why it happened. I told myself, "You're capable. You're responsible. You've got this." Yet, here I was again, stuck in the same loop of waiting, hesitating, and then watching opportunities slip through my fingers. The fear wasn't external. It felt like it was coming from inside, a voice whispering caution even when the path was bright. It made no sense until I started paying closer attention to the little cracks beneath the surface. It's embarrassing to admit, but the most painful part wasn't losing money or time. It was feeling like I was my own worst enemy. I imagined what it must look like to others, someone who just can't get their act together, who throws away chances. But deep down, I wasn't reckless or careless. There was something else at play, something deeply rooted that kept me stuck even when I desperately wanted change. I started noticing how these moments weren't random accidents. They were like signals, small alarms my brain was sending when I was on the edge of doing something new, risky, or out of my comfort zone. It was as if my own mind was creating obstacles to push me back into what it knew, even though what it knew wasn't working for me. Every procrastination, every doubtful thought, every neat little excuse was a piece of a pattern I couldn't ignore anymore. Talking about this felt like opening a door to a secret world where my fears weren't just irrational. They had a story, a purpose. But the purpose wasn't obvious at first. I doubted myself a lot. Why would my mind want to hold me back? Why sabotage my success when I worked so hard for it? The more I grappled with these questions, the more I realized I wasn't alone. So many of us share this silent struggle where progress teeters on the edge of collapse due to hidden forces we rarely admit to ourselves. As I peeled back the layers, the clarity grew. What once felt like failure started to look more like a protective shield, an unconscious defense against change that feels scary, even when change is good. There was no villain here, no moral flaw. Instead, there was a survival mechanism gone awry, gently but persistently nudging me back into safe territory, no matter how limiting. Now, looking back, I'm beginning to understand that this invisible cycle, the ebb and flow of hope and hesitation, isn't something to fight against with sheer willpower. It's something to see with tenderness, something to learn from, and then gently redirect. What shocked me most was how subtle this self-interference is. It doesn't scream, it whispers. It creeps in during quiet moments and behind procrastination's polite veil. It disguises itself as harmless distractions, as fleeting doubts, as little indulgences that feel like rewards but actually drain more than they give. And the impact? It's not just about a bank balance or a missed investment. It's about the way this pattern shapes how I see myself in the world, someone stuck in cycles of starts and stops, constantly wrestling with invisible boundaries. It's about feeling caught between desire and fear, ambition and hesitation, hope and an almost inexplicable resistance. This realization opened a door. I started wondering, what if this isn't the end of the story? What if this pattern could be revealed, understood, and even healed? I've walked far enough to see that the hardest part isn't recognizing the pattern. It's knowing exactly how to gently step out of it, without creating new battles inside myself. So, here I am, inviting you to walk with me. Because this isn't just my story, it's a journey that many of us share in silence. And it's time to name what's happening beneath the surface, to recognize those subtle self-sabotaging moves before they erase the promise of our progress. Together, we'll explore how these invisible loops show up, not always in obvious ways, and how we might gently interrupt them. We'll look at the moments when fear masquerades as procrastination or when guilt secretly tugs us away from growth. We'll face the uncomfortable truth that sometimes our own brain chooses the familiar over possibility, even when we want more. I want you to ask yourself, for a moment, where do you find yourself hesitating as financial doors begin to open? When do you feel that inexplicable pull back towards safety, even if it doesn't serve your dreams? The answers we uncover may surprise us, but in their surprise, there is also immense opportunity. It's not a story about weakness or failure. It's about uncovering a hidden dance between fear and desire, a dance that we often don't realize we're in. And once we see the steps, we can learn new moves, ones that lead us to freedom instead of stagnation. This is our chance to start that journey, to see, to feel, and to gently transform the invisible barriers that hold us back. And in doing so, to begin crafting a financial life not just of numbers and goals, but of understanding, healing, and quiet strength. One afternoon, I found myself hesitating in front of an email from a client offering a promising project. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, ready to respond with enthusiasm, yet an inexplicable chill ran down my spine. It wasn't uncertainty about the work itself. I'd done similar projects before, but an odd resistance bloomed within me, whispering cautions I couldn't easily dismiss. I paused, fidgeted, then shut the laptop, convincing myself I'd wait until tomorrow to reply. That day turned into a week, and the opportunity slipped away. I now understand that moment wasn't mere indecision. It was my mind erecting invisible barricades, cloaked as second thoughts, to steer me away from change despite the potential benefits. Moments like these aren't sudden roadblocks, but subtle forks in the path where my instincts enshroud progress with doubt. Reflecting on these patterns, I recalled a friend's story, Callie, a gifted artist who eagerly saved enough to open her own studio. As her savings neared the goal, she began binge shopping for supplies she didn't need or attending endless, unrelated social events. It wasn't irresponsible spending, but an unconscious sidetrack her psyche employed to stall the looming financial leap. This compelled me to realize such behaviors are rarely overt self-destruction. Instead, they imitate familiar comfort zones dressed up as distractions or minor indulgences, acting like smoke signals from the mind signaling, proceed with caution. Recognizing these covert signals feels like learning a new language, one that warns us not to move forward too fast, because the terrain ahead, although promising, remains unfamiliar and uncertain. My own experience deepened when I noticed how these internal alarms could pivot on the smallest triggers. For example, a sudden unexpected expense would awaken a flood of anxiety, sending me into avoidance mode. Instead of facing the financial reality, I'd delay paying bills or budgeting, which then fueled guilt spirals and paralysis. The mind's way of shielding itself can ironically generate more turmoil than the original stressor. It was as if the protective shield transformed into a cage, confining me within a shrinking sense of control. This collateral emotional damage proved illuminating. Protection mechanisms can misfire, trapping us in loops that make emotional safety feel synonymous with stagnation, like an old, threadbare blanket we refuse to replace. Another angle emerged when I observed how my relationship to success was entangled with unspoken narratives about worthiness. On one occasion, after completing a lucrative freelance project, a wave of unease surged through me instead of satisfaction. I caught myself wondering, silently, did I earn this? Am I deserving of this pay? These nagging self-doubts weren't born from logic, but early encounters with criticism wrapped in financial scarcity messages I'd internalized during childhood. They circulated quietly beneath my confidence, subtly undermining the very successes I worked hard to achieve. It was as if some inner voice feared abundance, not because wealth itself was wrong, but because the identity formed around scarcity clashed fiercely with the idea of thriving. Understanding this tension helped me recognize that for some of us, the quest for financial growth involves a delicate dance between self-acceptance and undoing old, limiting stories about value. Once, in a moment of clarity during meditation, I visualized my mind as an old garden, tangled with wild vines representing these fears and counterproductive scripts. The vines wrapped tight around promising new shoots, opportunities for growth and change, struggling to choke them before they could flourish. This metaphor resonated deeply. My brain wasn't the enemy but a gatekeeper, confusedly balancing desire for growth with urges to maintain equilibrium. By noticing how the garden looked and where light could penetrate, I discovered subtle ways to prune those vines through awareness, patience, and gentle curiosity, rather than hacking recklessly at my own roots. Now, consider how this applies when you face moments of financial decision. What hidden conversations are you having with yourself when opportunity knocks? Do invisible hands steer you towards safe but limiting choices? Or do you find excuses that sound reasonable on the surface but might be veils for deeper apprehension? When I asked myself these questions, I uncovered the quiet scripts that dictated much of my behavior, scripts I hadn't acknowledged, yet which governed my responses with surprising rigidity. One afternoon, after months of chronic procrastination, I decided to map out these inner scripts on paper. Writing them down unveiled surprising patterns. Phrases like, better safe than sorry, money is hard to keep, or I don't deserve abundance. Seeing these beliefs exposed them to scrutiny, allowing me to question their origins and validity. The act of externalizing internal dialogue gave me tools to begin rewriting these narratives more intentionally. It was as if I'd held a secret map to a maze, and suddenly, I could trace new paths instead of wandering aimlessly. Because what I've come to understand is that the mind's resistance to progress isn't a flaw, but a misunderstanding rooted in survival instincts wired long before our current context. The brain prefers the comfort of predictable habits, even when they limit our potential, because unpredictability signals threat at a neurological level. This ingrained response is so powerful that it often manifests as self-imposed obstacles, tactics our psyche uses to keep us within known boundaries. Acknowledging this helped me cultivate compassion toward my inner critic, recognizing it not as an adversary, but as a cautionary ally misreading signals in a new environment. In one vivid example, I realized how my tendency to delay financial planning surged whenever I felt emotionally vulnerable. After a difficult breakup, my avoidance escalated markedly. Dealing with money became overwhelming, triggering bouts of escapism. It dawned on me that times of emotional rawness magnify internal protective forces, causing behaviors that seem irrational superficially but reflect a deeper attempt to hold onto control by clinging to old patterns. Recognizing this interplay sharpened my ability to respond with care rather than frustration when those cycles appeared, transforming resistance into an invitation for healing. Collectively, these discoveries carved out a clearer picture of the mind's intricate choreography during financial transitions. They revealed how emotional undercurrents and unconscious scripts interweave, orchestrating responses that masquerade as obstacles but are actually covert attempts at self-preservation. Embracing this complexity offered me an entry point for meaningful change, shifting from battling internal forces to engaging with them thoughtfully, opening a space where growth isn't met with fear, but with understanding and possibility. I recall sitting at the kitchen table one evening, a pile of unopened bills scattered around me. Instead of tackling them, I found myself caught in a loop of distractions, checking my phone repeatedly, scrolling endlessly through social media feeds, and then switching to mindless TV shows. What struck me most was the fierce urge to escape the discomfort, yet the source of unease was vague and elusive. That restless energy was not laziness or irresponsibility. It was an internal conflict playing out beneath my conscious awareness, as if my psyche was weaving a silent narrative urging resistance to progress. It manifested through subtle avoidance tactics that drained my energy and diverted my attention, ultimately stalling the momentum I desperately sought. An incident from a coworker's life illuminated this pattern more sharply for me. Mark, who prided himself on financial discipline, suddenly found himself splurging on expensive gadgets during a period when he was supposed to be saving for a business venture. His friends teased him about treating himself, but beneath the surface laughter hid a deeper story. Mark confided, "It's like my brain's playing tricks. When I try to build something bigger, I sabotage it with little rewards that are actually setbacks." This confession resonated profoundly because it framed self-sabotage not as a moral failing, but as a complex game of impulses tugging in conflicting directions. The tug-of-war between wanting growth and seeking comfort paints a nuanced picture of the emotional architecture influencing our spending habits. One afternoon, as I reflected on this, I realized such internal battles mirror a delicate balancing act between striving for progress and clinging to safety nets built from past experiences. Imagine a tightrope walker navigating between two skyscrapers. The thrill of advancement competes against the paralyzing fear of a misstep. That tension creates micro-decisions that shape our financial journey. Some propel us forward, others cascade into gradual withdrawal. Our brains don't always register the psychological risk in pursuit of abundance as positive. Rather, the unfamiliar triggers signals to retreat, maintaining a semblance of equilibrium. These nuances explain why making sensible choices sometimes feels like wrestling with an opponent within, with no clear rules or referee. A particularly vivid realization emerged when I recalled my reaction after a surprise bonus landed in my bank account. Instead of excitement, I grappled with an inexplicable sense of guilt, so overpowering it unsettled my stomach. It was as if earning more money somehow violated an unspoken rule engraved within me by early life messaging or cultural scripts. This aversion to prosperity cozied up with self-limitations, the quiet voice whispering that more wealth brought not freedom, but expectations and pressures too weighty to carry. These conflicts create a subtle push-pull dynamic, yearning for improvement entangled with fears of losing identity or betraying long-held beliefs about who we are allowed to be. Another layer revealing itself in my journey is the role of perfectionism as a disguised saboteur. When I set overly rigid expectations for financial outcomes or timelines, even minor setbacks triggered harsh self-criticism and a retreat into inactivity. Perfection became a double-edged sword, elevating my standards while simultaneously breeding paralysis through fear of imperfection. Like a painter refusing to touch the canvas until every detail is just right, I stalled, inadvertently freezing my progress. This harsh internal judge confined my creative financial decisions within narrow margins, preventing the experimentation and risk-taking necessary for growth. Recognizing perfectionism's stealthy power unveiled a new path to gentler self-talk and more flexible planning approaches. On one particularly restless night, I sat with a journal, pen hovering uncertainly over the blank page. I chose to write an unsent letter addressed to my apprehensions, a way to dialogue with the emotional forces at work. The words poured out. I know you're trying to keep me safe, but safety doesn't always mean staying still. Growth is frightening, yes, but you don't have to face it alone. This act was transformative. It shifted the internal tone from confrontation to curiosity, opening space for understanding instead of resistance. Writing allowed me to disarm the silent saboteur by acknowledging its intentions without surrendering to its demands, nurturing a relationship with those parts rather than battling them head-on. I invite you to reflect on moments where hesitation seems inexplicable or where impulses nudge you off the course despite your conscious goals. Are there hidden negotiations happening silently within? Recognizing these dialogues between caution and courage, comfort and expansion, is essential. When you witness these unseen negotiations, you can gradually reshape them. A practical way to spot these inner conflicts is by tuning into emotional cues, a tightening chest before decision-making, an urge to distract yourself when a financial choice appears, or sudden justifications that halt action. These signals are invitations, messages from parts of you seeking acknowledgement and reassurance amid uncertainty. Understanding the subtle emotional currents that influence your financial behavior gave me a framework to anticipate self-sabotage as predictable rather than mysterious. This shift empowered me to approach each crossroads with gentleness rather than judgment, transforming conflict into collaboration. The journey continues, but embracing these hidden dialogues uncovered the complexity of self-protection mechanisms and opened the door for new, compassionate strategies to navigate change with intention and grace. I remember the day vividly when I first realized how deeply my spending was intertwined with my emotions. It wasn't triggered by some grand financial event, but by a simple impulse. Walking past a store window, I caught a flash of a jacket that somehow seemed to promise transformation. I told myself this purchase was a reward for my hard work, but as soon as the receipt printed, an uneasy feeling clawed at my chest. That garment had become a symbol, not just of style or warmth, but of an underlying emotional craving to fill a void left by stress and uncertainty. What struck me most was how often financial choices morphed into attempts to soothe inner unrest, acting as silent substitutions for direct emotional expression. One afternoon, while discussing this with a close friend, I uncovered a pattern I hadn't truly grasped before. She confessed that during periods of tension, she instinctively cleared her credit card debt by making several small purchases, confusing her relief from emotional pressure with financial progress. Her method created a temporary distraction, but subtly increased her outflow in ways that undermined her bigger goals. This interaction propelled me to reflect on how emotional spending isn't sudden recklessness, but sometimes a well-worn habit to quiet feelings we find overwhelming or difficult to name. Essentially, these expenditures serve as fleeting escape hatches amidst storms of insecurity and unease. Exploring further, I realized how the concept of emotional tethering undercut my capacity for long-term money management. There were moments when hopes for advancement ignited excitement, only to be shadowed swiftly by resignation. It reminded me of a boat tethered too tightly to the dock. It can drift no matter how strong the winds urging it toward new horizons. I've seen this happen when I set ambitious financial goals but abandoned them after the initial enthusiasm waned, leaving the deeper fears untreated, causing stagnation disguised as distraction or being busy. The invisible cords of old anxieties, often unaddressed, held me back from genuine momentum. Then there was the peculiar case of an unexpected promotion. Initially, celebration felt natural, but soon, a subtle yet persistent uneasiness settled in. An internal narrative along the lines of, "What if you can't keep this up?" whispered relentlessly. This voice instigated hesitation when making even modest investments or stepping into leadership roles. The cognitive friction between newfound possibility and dormant self-doubt carved deep grooves of ambivalence in my approach to financial growth. These feelings were not overt objections, but quiet murmurs steering choices toward cautious conservatism, limiting potential achievements. An unrelated memory also surfaced, painting a vivid contrast. As a teenager, I watched my grandmother meticulously budget every penny, yet she balked when confronted with the idea of improving her economic situation through new ventures. Her cautious nature wasn't laziness, but a deeply ingrained survival instinct, honed by decades of scarcity. Although her thrift was admirable, it also imposed invisible ceilings on what she allowed herself to pursue, reflecting a familial shadow I gradually recognized in my own financial hesitations. This lineage of caution encouraged me to consider how ancestral experiences subtly sculpted our collective psyche about money and risk. One afternoon, I confronted a crucial realization while sorting through receipts and bank statements. The numbers told one story, a trajectory inching upward, but the narrative woven between lines revealed emotional minorities that sabotaged progress. For example, a seemingly minor impulse purchase triggered days of guilt, compelling me into compensatory behaviors like skipping necessary expenses or avoiding planning sessions. This rhythmic dance between indulgence and restriction echoed a psychological pendulum swinging uncontrollably. It manifested as internal negotiations I was barely aware of, but that seriously hindered financial growth. Conversations with therapists introduced me to the idea of emotional budgeting, a practice designed to separate feelings from cost evaluations, allowing moments of mindfulness before transactions. Embracing this approach transformed many of my impulsive spirals into deliberate reflections. Before reaching for the credit card, I began asking, what am I truly seeking with this? Or, will this purchase calm me or confuse me further? This inquiry didn't always halt expenditure, but created space for deeper honesty, revealing hidden motives I previously ignored. Recognizing triggers with compassionate curiosity forged a new path from reaction toward conscious choice, empowering me to reclaim agency over resources. Through these explorations, a complex truth revealed itself. Financial self-sabotage frequently masquerades as comfort-seeking cloaked in familiar routines. The internal mechanisms designed to protect us from emotional overwhelm paradoxically replicate old wounds by discouraging change. At times, these protective impulses disguise themselves as idle distractions, subtle fear, or small compulsions that fracture consistent progress. Unpacking these layers requires patience, empathy, and readiness to face discomfort not by fleeing, but by gently unraveling the tangled threads of inner narratives. Now, consider how it feels the next time you find yourself compulsively spending or hesitating before a money-related decision. What sensations ripple through your body? Could there be a quiet yearning beneath that behavior, a wish for security, connection, or recognition that you haven't named yet? Reflect on these moments with a gentle lens, as if listening to a buried melody beneath static. Naming these emotional undertones not only sheds light on their origins, but also empowers you to choose responses that nurture long-term well-being rather than momentary relief. The journey of disentangling these emotional bindings is intricate, demanding honesty and self-compassion. As I ventured through this path, I learned to honor the vulnerability tucked within financial choices, allowing space for missteps without harsh judgment. By cultivating mindful awareness of emotional influences, I paved the way from unconscious loops toward intentional engagements with my finances, inviting growth that balances heart with strategy, courage with care. I found myself tangled in an internal tug-of-war after receiving an unexpected inheritance from a distant relative. The moment the news settled, a flood of uneasiness washed over me, defying my logical mind's insistence that this was a genuine windfall. Instead of feeling gratitude or excitement, I grappled with an overwhelming ambivalence that left me paralyzed. That tension didn't scream. It hummed quietly within, like an undercurrent pulling me back just as I was about to dive in. I realized this wasn't simply resistance to sudden abundance, but a sophisticated defense wired to guard against shifts that could unsettle my fragile sense of self. My experience reminded me of an old story I'd once heard about a man who inherited a garden full of untamed wildflowers. At first, he felt joy imagining the blooms, but as the seasons changed, the unpredictability bothered him. The errant seeds scattered beyond his neat fences represented uncertainty. In his desire to impose order, he uprooted many of the blooms, not realizing that his own discomfort was the actual limit to the garden's richness. That image resonated deeply with me. How often do we unknowingly uproot opportunities because the unfamiliar intimidates more than it inspires? The wild garden became a powerful metaphor for the tension between wanting growth and fearing the chaos it may bring. Building on that insight, I noticed moments when this inner hesitation morphed into compulsive saving behaviors. Oddly, I would squirrel away resources obsessively, as if amassing a buffer could stave off unseen dangers. Yet, the irony was stark. These measures became a form of self-imposed scarcity, limiting my ability to invest in growth or joy. This paradox taught me that excessive caution often disguises itself as prudence, but secretly blocks the flow of abundance. My saving wasn't purely about numbers. It was deeply connected to a narrative woven from old insecurities, whispering that generosity or risk equated to vulnerability. Then there was the curious case of my hesitant steps toward entrepreneurship. After years working cautiously within corporate structures, the idea of blazing my own trail ignited both exhilaration and dread. I found myself oscillating wildly, drafting business plans with fervor, only to bury them in drawers for weeks. The procrastination was not laziness, but a delicate dance of doubt and desire clashing in every cell. During those moments, I pictured a tightrope walker suspended between two cliffs, the pull of safety anchoring one foot while the other searched for solid ground. This internal balancing act revealed that launching an independent venture was wrapped up not just in financial logistics, but a profound negotiation with trust in myself. My friend Elena provided a striking parallel. A gifted writer, she repeatedly delayed submitting her manuscript to publishers, even as enthusiasm burned bright. When we talked one evening, she confided, "It's like I'm waiting for permission I'll never get, from someone or somewhere inside me." Her metaphor awakened something inside me, a recognition that internalized voices of doubt or past criticisms often masquerade as gatekeepers, subtly enforcing ceilings no external force places. This realization deepened my understanding of self-sabotage as a kind of internal policing born from experience, conditioning, and unspoken fears. Further complicating this dynamic was the influence of cultural narratives I'd absorbed growing up. Messages about money being dirty or that wealth corrupts ran through family stories, spoken and unspoken alike. These inherited tales created invisible walls around prosperity, casting success in shades of suspicion. At times, I felt the pull of these ancestral whispers more strongly in moments of opportunity, an almost magnetic force urging caution or retreat. Recognizing these inherited beliefs offered a new lens, not to blame our lineage, but to appreciate the complexity of disentangling personal goals from collective histories. One evening, after a particularly restless day, I decided to explore these patterns through an old technique, guided visualization. I closed my eyes and imagined walking through a labyrinth made of mirrors, each reflecting versions of myself across time: childhood, adolescence, adulthood. Some reflections were confident, others harbored fear and skepticism. In navigating this maze, I began to see how past selves built barriers to protect what seemed precious but, in doing so, blocked paths leading out. The breakthrough came when I acknowledged each reflection with kindness, understanding that every incarnation acted with good intention, creating space for healing rather than confrontation. Now, consider applying this awareness when that sudden hesitation snatches your breath as you contemplate a new financial step. What hidden reflections are begging for recognition? What old protectors may be mistaking growth for threat? The answers often arise not from force, but from inviting curiosity and compassion into those quiet spaces where self-doubt lingers. Initiating this gentle dialogue with ourselves unfurls fresh possibilities, transforming what once constrained us into allies in the journey toward flourishing. Through this lens, the seemingly conflicting impulses, fear, excitement, hesitation, courage, form a tapestry of desires striving for balance. Our inner world is not a battlefield to win, but a complex ecosystem requiring patience, trust, and nuanced care. Embracing this perspective allowed me to shift from internal conflict to inner conversation, creating a foundation from which real transformation might emerge. I sat quietly in a small cafe, watching the rain blur the city lights outside the window. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the soft murmur of conversations, yet my mind was far from the cozy scene. I was wrestling with a subtle but persistent inner voice that urged me to slow down, to question every decision related to my finances. It wasn't loud or confrontational. Instead, it took the form of fleeting doubts and impulsive distractions that interrupted my progress. That evening, I realized how deeply entwined my financial hesitations were with a complex web of mental shortcuts and cognitive blind spots that frequently escape notice. In particular, I became fascinated by the way my brain often defaulted to what psychologists call confirmation bias. I'd start with a vague belief, like, I'm doomed to fail at managing money, or wealth isn't meant for people like me, and then unconsciously seek out information or experiences that validated those ideas. This meant that even small setbacks weren't isolated happenings, but pieces of a carefully constructed narrative that reinforced my insecurities. The irony struck me. My perception of reality wasn't objective but shaped by these internal filters, blinding me to opportunities and progress already within reach. To illustrate, I recalled a coworker who, despite consistent raises and positive performance reviews, kept doubting her ability to maintain financial stability. When a minor unexpected expense disrupted her budget, her mind instantly magnified the event, interpreting it as proof she wasn't equipped for financial responsibility. Suddenly, months of steady progress vanished in her view, replaced by a looming fear of inevitable collapse. Witnessing this pattern mirrored my own experiences. It dawned on me that unchecked biases could fuel a self-fulfilling prophecy, reinforcing obstacles more by how situations were interpreted than by facts alone. Another layer that tangled my financial thinking was the availability heuristic, where recent or emotionally charged events disproportionately influenced my decision-making. For example, early on, I'd heard several accounts from friends about financial scams or risky investments gone awry. Though these incidents were statistically rare, they lodged deep within my imagination, casting long shadows on any new venture I contemplated. Consequently, This wariness manifested as hesitation or avoidance, blocking me from exploring sound opportunities that could have advanced my goals. My mind was prioritizing dramatic caution stories over measured risk assessment, a subtle mental bias acting like a brake on progress. Additionally, my awareness grew around the paradox of loss aversion. The fear of losing what I already possessed was far more thrilling than the prospect of potential gain. I noticed this during a chance to invest in a promising startup. Despite thorough research, a quiet dread whispered about the money slipping away, making me recoil from commitment. Even when logical analysis suggested high reward chances, my emotions clung to the pain of hypothetical losses as a guiding force. This imbalance subtly skewed my choices toward safety nets, slowing momentum and fueling a cycle of missed possibilities masked as prudence. Throughout this journey, I began tracking moments when my mind slipped into cognitive traps. I used journaling to record not only financial decisions, but the accompanying emotions and thoughts. Gradually, patterns emerged, how certain fears sprung from distorted interpretations rather than reality, how impulsive reactions germinated from mental shortcuts designed to protect rather than empower. This sparked a shift. By shining light on these invisible roller coasters of thought, I regained agency to question and restructure my default responses. It felt like installing new lenses to see clearly where once haze prevailed. During a conversation with a mentor, she spoke about the confirmation loop that entraps many in repetitive cycles of limiting beliefs. She urged me to actively seek out evidence challenging ingrained assumptions, to gather stories of success and resilience that defied my apprehensions. Taking her advice, I immersed myself in biographies and podcasts sharing diverse financial journeys marked by setbacks transformed into breakthroughs. Gradually, these narratives rewired my internal playlists, softening the grip of negative patterns and fostering a mindset open to experimentation, resilience, and hope. In practical moments, I developed a ritual of pausing before key decisions, grounding myself through mindfulness and a deliberate review of assumptions at play. This practice created space to ask questions like, am I being swayed by fear stories from my past? Or, what would an impartial observer suggest here? Rather than plunging headlong into anxiety-driven choices, this pause became a bridge from reaction to reflection. Over time, this simple tactic felt like a compass recalibrating my direction amid turbulent waters, steering toward deliberate action anchored in clarity. Now, consider how this applies when hesitation creeps in during your own financial crossroads. What hidden mental filters might be coloring your perceptions, skewing reality toward caution or doubt? What stories do you tell yourself that may no longer serve your growth? Recognizing these cognitive tendencies is not about blame, but about reclaiming control over the narratives that shape your journey. Through patient attention and compassionate curiosity, the fog lifts, revealing new pathways previously obscured by unseen mental patterns. The journey to understanding these inner workings continued to transform my experience with money. I learned that beyond external factors, the architecture of my thoughts played a crucial role in enabling or restricting progress. This insight opened a new front in the quest for financial empowerment, one that involves not only strategy, but also deep mental awareness, inviting me to become an active architect of my own mindset rather than a passive participant in unconscious loops. I remember the moment I caught myself hesitating at the edge of a promising opportunity, a freelance contract that aligned perfectly with my skills and interests. The invitation arrived unexpectedly, wrapped in enthusiasm and potential growth. Yet, a strange fog settled over my mind, clouding my thoughts with vague but insistent reasons to delay responding. I told myself I needed just a bit more time, even though deep inside, I sensed this postponement stemmed from something far less rational. This invisible inertia felt like walking through molasses, sticky and slow, as if some unseen tether pulled me back from stepping forward. It became clear that ambivalence was taking a peculiar shape, almost like a guardian fiercely guarding the known perimeter while silently warning of perils lurking beyond. This dynamic revealed itself even more sharply during a weekend retreat when I shared my experience with a group of peers. Among them was Jonathan, a startup founder who described a similar paralysis just before launching his first product. I was sitting on the cusp of a breakthrough, he said, But suddenly, my mind bombarded me with uncertainties. The market might reject, investors could pull out. What if I wasn't enough? I became my own worst adversary, not out of sabotage, but because my brain was desperately holding on to safety. Hearing him speak, I realized this pause wasn't a passive flaw, but an active attempt to prevent overwhelming vulnerability. It resembled a defense mechanism more subtle than outright fear, a whisper cloaked in caution and false security. Digging deeper, I recognized that this inner resistance often spins into a complex choreography between ambition and anxiety. Whenever momentum built, subtle habits emerged to dilute my energy. For instance, I'd suddenly notice an urge to organize my workspace or scroll through news endlessly, seemingly productive distractions that actually diluted my focus. Like a storm that quietly shifts direction, these diversions appeared harmless, but gradually shifted me away from action. This nuance revealed how mental avoidance can intertwine with day-to-day routines, morphing into elaborate crafts that shield us from confronting uncomfortable change. Another layer surfaced in the form of concealed narratives tied to identity and worth. I recalled a mentor advising that growth sometimes awakens dormant beliefs about inadequacy, scripts inherited from years past whispering. Success isn't meant for you, or don't outshine others. I began to hear those voices reverberating when progress threatened my equilibrium. It was as if achieving more inflicted a symbolic wound to a fragile self-concept, needing repair through subtle reticence. What astonished me was how these messages operated below the surface, weaving through decisions as intangible as shadows, but as real as any spoken word. A particularly vivid episode unfolded when a financial award arrived after a long period of effort and uncertainty. Instead of relief or pride, a hollow quietness took hold. That paradoxical emptiness effortlessly filled by second-guessing. Was I truly deserving? Could I sustain this level? What would others think? These questions weren't simply reflections. They formed an internal echo chamber where doubt magnified itself, shaping not just my emotions but the trajectory of my actions. It was as if the prize became an ambiguous mirror revealing my contradictions, simultaneously illuminating hope and insecurities intertwined. Building on these revelations, I explored new strategies to gently approach this delicate tension. I experimented with what I called micro-commits, tiny, manageable steps toward goals that felt less intimidating. Instead of aiming for monumental change, I allowed myself brief, deliberate actions, drafting a single email, jotting down ideas without pressure, or setting a timer for focused work sessions. What emerged was a gradual unraveling of paralysis, a way to steady the volatile dance between enthusiasm and retreat. It became apparent that honoring my own rhythm and limits didn't signify avoidance, but served as a powerful invitation to re-engage with intention. During this period, I also reflected on how social comparisons intensified these inner struggles. Observing peers seemingly racing ahead triggered mixed emotions. Admiration mingled with envy, motivation combined with insecurity. This invisible lens distorted reality, making my own progress seem paltry in comparison. I recognized that these feelings nudged me toward withdrawal, defending against perceived failure or inadequacy. This insight shifted my focus toward cultivating a personal definition of success, one grounded in authenticity and incremental growth, free from external yardsticks that had long dictated my self-worth. Now, consider how this applies when you feel your own energy dimming just as you near a breakthrough. What subtle behaviors redirect your attention? What inner dialogues unconsciously narrate caution or hesitation? These questions aren't tests, but invitations to witness patterns previously hidden beneath the surface. Approaching your experiences with curiosity instead of judgment can illuminate the intricate roots of resistance, creating new pathways toward genuine progress. By embracing small, consistent gestures aligned with your values, you reclaim agency over the inner tug-of-war, cultivating resilience and renewed momentum. I could still picture the cramped office where this realization hit me hardest. My desk was buried under stacks of unopened envelopes and half-finished projects, and the buzz of fluorescent lights overhead seemed to vibrate with my growing frustration. I had just landed a client whose account could have transformed my small business, But instead of diving in, an unfamiliar heaviness anchored me to inaction. I found myself maneuvering through a maze of excuses, too tired, too busy, not ready enough. Yet beneath each rationalization lurked a tension I couldn't easily name. It resembled a quiet rebellion within my own mind, a tug-of-war between the pull of progress and an invisible force urging me to resist transformation. The strangest part was that this resistance thrived not on overt fear, but on a complex blend of uncertainty and old emotional imprints. I remembered a childhood memory of watching family members avoid discussing money, treating it like a silent taboo. Their discomfort baked itself into my psyche, layering over any present interactions with an unspoken rule. Financial change meant discomfort, upheaval, perhaps loss. Against that backdrop, my hesitation unfolded less as a conscious choice than an inherited reflex. It felt like wandering a well-trodden path marked by indirect warnings, compelling me toward familiar stagnancy, disguised as cautious responsibility. An encounter with an old mentor later unraveled threads I hadn't perceived before. Over strong coffee, she shared how many people unintentionally paint themselves into cornered narratives shaped by incomplete understanding of their own process. Our brains adore predictability, even if it's limiting, she said. If you glimpse freedom, it will trigger a protective grip, but that grip weakens when curiosity leads your steps. Her insight made me realize I was trying to force myself forward relying solely on discipline, ignoring the subtle hooks of comfort my mind clung to. Like attempting to sprint through molasses, sheer effort alone couldn't dissolve the sticky webs woven by my unconscious habits. With this realization, I began experimenting with a strategy of slow exposure, attending carefully to the emotional rhythms beneath my aversion. Instead of pushing relentlessly, I allowed moments of pause, observing the impulses that curtailed my forward motion without judgment. Through journaling, I unearthed emotions I'd long suppressed: vulnerability, fear of loss, and a quiet skepticism about my own worthiness. These facets weren't signals of failure. Rather, they were the sentinels of my soul, urging me to listen deeply before making leaps. Slowly, I mapped these feelings alongside decisions, tracing a constellation of triggers that connected emotional patterns with financial choices. A shift occurred when I shared this process with a trusted friend, Mia, who had wrestled for years with similar inertia in her creative career. She described her blocks as whirlpool moments, instances when excitement preceded an engulfing swirl of doubt, sucking away clarity and resolve. Hearing her phrase, it so vividly connected with my own experiences. She began using meditation and breathing exercises to anchor her attention, breaking the whirlpools into manageable eddies. Inspired, I adapted elements of her practice, cultivating presence in moments when avoidance threatened to take hold. These techniques didn't erase the discomfort, they softened its edges, allowing me to navigate through rather than around it. During this time, I encountered a moment that crystallized these lessons, a conversation with a potential client that could have expanded my business significantly. The prospect stirred both eagerness and a shadow of resistance that I now recognized as familiar. When the call ended, instead of plunging into immediate action, I made space to reflect on my hesitation. I wrote, "What story am I telling myself right now? What fears are feeding my pause?" Tracing these tender layers revealed that my inner voice feared not just practical failure, but existential change. The idea of evolving beyond identities I had held for years. A surge of compassion arose. I wasn't fighting sabotage, but gently coaxing a guarded self toward trust. Encouraged, I broke down the daunting project into a series of modest, achievable tasks. I celebrated each small completion by noting the growth beneath the accomplishment. The sense of calm replacing anxiety, the blossoming confidence threading through pauses that had once felt like walls. Bit by bit, the stagnant fog dispersed, revealing a clearer path brightened by intentional choices infused with self-awareness. This process demonstrated that monumental change doesn't always demand leaps. Sometimes it grows quietly within incremental steps embraced with kindness. Reflecting on this journey, I realized that financial self-sabotage often masquerades as habitual caution deeply embedded in emotional memory and identity. Transforming these patterns requires patience and dialogue with inner resistance, not domination over it. When you face moments where momentum softens or retreats unexpectedly, tune deeply into those discomforts. Ask not what's wrong with you, but what old stories or fears those responses carry. Inviting curiosity instead of conflict turns hesitation from enemy into guide, leading you toward uncharted territories of possibility with greater ease and grace. Reflecting on this journey so far, I notice how the threads weaving through my experience form a subtle yet intricate tapestry, one that resists neat unraveling but invites attentive exploration. It's as though a vast beneath the woodland ecosystem hums quietly beneath our feet, with roots entwined so deeply they reshape the very soil we think we stand on. The more I attune myself to these hidden currents moving within, the clearer it becomes that the internal landscape of financial hesitation and impulsivity cannot be separated from the emotional weather swirling inside me. The tension that once seemed a mere obstacle takes on the quality of a living, breathing force, complex, nuanced, and profoundly human. In moments of quiet reflection, I find myself drawn into a dialogue between competing parts of my psyche. There's an ever-watchful observer gently urging forward motion, hungry for possibility and expansion, while simultaneously a wary sentinel clutches tightly to the known. These voices intertwine in a precarious dance, at times stepping on each other's toes, at times gliding with surprising grace. The dance's choreography unfolds with a rhythm both familiar and strange, a rhythm that echoes far beyond financial matters, touching tenderly on identity, safety, and our intrinsic relationship with change itself. This terrain evokes an ancient metaphor, a river carving its course through resistant stone. The force is steady but patient, not rushing to dominate but persistent enough to forge new pathways over time. Like the river, my internal shifts are gradual, sometimes imperceptible amid currents, undertows, and eddies, but together they possess a transformative power that reshapes boundaries once thought immovable. The resistance we encounter thus becomes less an adversary and more a vital participant in the gradual unfolding of growth, a necessary counterbalance inviting wisdom in how we navigate the terrain. I realize that the tapestry we weave to hold our financial and emotional worlds becomes a lived negotiation, a language composed not merely of numbers and strategies, but of delicate emotional attunements, unspoken agreements, and renegotiated promises we make with ourselves. As we travel this landscape, moments of tension and release do not signal failure or weakness. Instead, they illuminate the depth of our inner architecture and the vastness of the journey itself. There is a common edge in this shared voyage where vulnerability meets resilience, and it's on this edge that new possibilities quietly gestate. Where I once saw resistance as an obstacle to be overcome with sheer will, I now perceive it as an invitation to greater self-compassion and insight. The interplay of hesitation and desire pulses like a heartbeat beneath the more visible surface of decisions and actions. This pulse carries the echoes of countless past experiences, but also the whispers of yet-to-be-told stories, scripts colored by hope, fear, longing, and courage. I begin to understand that engaging with these currents requires more than knowledge. It asks for an openness to curiosity and patience with the unknown textures of my own inner world. As we move closer to a turning point, I invite you to lean into this rich, sometimes tangled terrain, not with urgency, but with gentle attentiveness. Let the shifting hues and subtle movements within your own experience settle into a creative conversation, a fertile ground from which transformation may emerge. The patterns we have traced together are not static lines etched in stone, but living contours that evolve as we engage with them. And in approaching them this way, we honor both the complexity of our personal histories and the expansive potential waiting just beyond the horizon of habituated thought and feeling. I remember the moment when, after countless stumbles and silent battles, a new awareness quietly settled inside me. It wasn't sudden or dramatic. It came through a gentle unraveling of the defense mechanisms I'd unknowingly built around my financial life. Like dawn breaking slowly across a shadowed landscape, clarity edged its way in, revealing an unexpected truth. The conflict I'd wrestled with was never about capability or worthiness. Instead, it was a complex dance of vulnerability and protection, a hidden choreography where my mind tried to guard me from risks it perceived as threats, even when those risks were doors to growth. In that moment, I saw my journey in a different light. The impulses I'd once judged harshly, the procrastination, the distractions, the hesitation, transformed into messages from a part of me wanting to survive, to keep me safe. Understanding this softened my inner dialogue, shifting from confrontation to compassion. It felt like meeting an old, cautious friend who had wandered alongside me all these years, guiding with a trembling hand through uncharted terrain. This shift didn't erase the challenges, but it changed how I related to them. Instead of fighting with myself, I began inviting a conversation between fear and hope, between uncertainty and possibility. With this new perspective, I realized that true transformation arises not from pushing past resistance with force, but from learning to listen deeply to the signals of inner conflict, honoring the legitimate fears while gently encouraging courage to move forward. The walls that once seemed immovable began to loosen as I embraced patience with my own rhythm, recognizing every small movement as a vital part of growth. In this dance, setbacks became invitations to explore old wounds, and moments of clarity appeared like bright sparks lighting the way through twilight. I recall a conversation with a friend who mirrored my experience. She confessed how her nervous pauses before financial decisions were less about indecision and more about an intimate struggle between desire and doubt. "It's like my heart beats one way, but my mind pulls back," she said softly. This honest sharing underscored how our journeys toward abundance are uniquely personal, filled with invisible crossroads, and often guided by inner voices shaped by past stories and deeply held beliefs. Recognizing this shared humanity eased the isolation I once felt, turning quiet struggles into collective exploration. Now, standing on the edge of possibility, I feel a fresh invitation to embrace the complexity of my own financial narrative with curiosity and care. To see hesitation not as failure, but as part of an unfolding process that asks me to learn about myself in richer, more nuanced ways. I recognize that prosperity begins from within, cultivated by emotional clarity, self-forgiveness, and the courage to hold contradictions without judgment. This is a journey that honors vulnerability as much as strength, allowing inner healing to fuel outer abundance. I want us to remember this. The patterns that slow us down are not enemies, but messengers, bringing wisdom through their persistence. When the urge to retreat swells, it can serve as a signal, not to stop, but to pause, listen, and engage with what's stirring beneath our awareness. In that sacred space, transformation is born. Our relationship with money, and by extension ourselves, deepens and expands beyond old limitations, opening pathways toward not only financial empowerment, but emotional freedom. So as I move forward, I carry with me a quiet reverence for this ongoing unfolding. Each choice, hesitation, and courageous step shapes a new narrative where I am both the vulnerable seeker and the loving guide. This balance invites me to live and create from a place where abundance flows not through resistance, but through alignment with my truest self. And in that alignment, I find a wellspring of possibility waiting patiently for us all.